Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. So today I'm going to discuss about exception handling in Java, which is very important topic, and this is also very important in terms of Selenium WebDriver automation testing. So until unless if you don't know how to handle the exceptions, then it would be very difficult for us to handle the exceptions. Okay, because many a times we are getting so many exception in Selenium WebDriver also, so we should know how to handle them. So this is the agenda for today. So we'll talk about what is an exception and how exception occurs. Okay, we'll talk about hierarchy of exception classes, and we'll see different type of exceptions like checked exception, that is compile time exception, and we have unchecked exceptions, that is runtime exceptions. Okay, so we'll talk about them and we'll see some examples of checked and unchecked exceptions. Okay, and at last we'll talk about how to handle exceptions, like we have try catch block, we have some other keywords, through and throws, and we have finally block. Okay, so we'll talk about all of them, but in today's tutorial I'm gonna concentrate on what is an exception and how it occurs and what are the different kind of exceptions. Okay, and in the next tutorial we'll talk about how to handle them. So we'll see examples of different exceptions today. Okay, so I don't want to make this video very lengthy, so we'll cover today what are the different exceptions. Okay, so let's see. So what is an exception? Okay, so an exception is a problem that arises during the execution of a program. Okay, or in other words you can say it's an unwanted situation that comes in between your program. Okay, so let me give an example. So suppose you have 10-15 lines of code. Okay, let's see like this, and exception comes in between. Okay, let's see, on the fourth line some exception comes. Okay, so these three lines of code will be executed properly, and when you come across this exception, then the rest of the code will not be executed. So we should know that how to handle this exception so that our program will execute it successfully. Okay, so let me come back. And in another definition, what you can say is it's an event that disrupts the normal flow of the program. So sometimes because of the exception, we may not get our expected result. Okay, so this is the definition of exception and how exception occurs. Okay, so generally we need to see like how exception occurs. So there are few scenarios I have listed down here. So following are some scenarios where an exception occurs. Okay, so a user has entered an invalid data, the first one. Okay, so take an example, a programmer written some code in written code for a page. Okay, so there one field is there. Okay, input field where it takes integer numbers like from 1 to 10. So take an example, if any user has entered like 11 or any negative number. Okay, so since programmer has made the restriction, so we have to and enter between 1 to 10. If we not enter within that range, then it will throw an definitely it will throw an exception if it is not handled properly. Okay, so that is an example of invalid data. That is the first one. Okay, a file that needs to be opened cannot be found. Okay, so suppose we are reading a file which is not present in our system, so definitely it will throw an exception, file not found found exception. Okay, and third one is a network connection has been lost in the middle of communications, or JVM has run out of memory. Okay, sometimes because of the connectivity issue, we can get an exception. Okay, and we may get an exception, or we can say in another thing is JVM has run out of memory, because of if memory is full, then definitely will get an exception. So these are different scenarios or situations where we may get an exceptions. Okay, so this is the hierarchy of exception class. Okay, so we have topmost, we have a throwable class, which is under java.util package. Okay, so these two classes, exception and error classes, there are two subclasses. Okay, exception and error, these two extends throwable class. Okay, an exception has four classes: IO exception, SQL exception, class not found, and a runtime exception. So these three classes, IO exception, SQL, and class not found, belongs to checked exceptions, or you can say compile time exception. Okay, these three. And we have another type which extends exception. So runtime exception. So this is unchecked exceptions. Okay, so we have arithmetic exception, null pointer exception, number format exception, and index out of bounds exception. And index out of bounds exception has two subclasses, which are array index out of bound exceptions, and another one is string index out of bound exceptions. Okay, so we'll see example of few classes here, like null pointer, arithmetic, something like that, index out of bound. We'll look into with Java program some examples. Okay, and the right side we have error. So I'm not going to talk about error because that is different thing. So while working with Selenium WebDriver, we'll talk about that. So there are three classes which extends error class. Okay, so we have stack overflow error, virtual machine error, and out of memory error. Now let's talk about the what are the different kind of exceptions. Okay, so we have checked exceptions, as we have discussed. So checked exceptions are checked at compile time. So this is what we can say, this is compile time exceptions. Okay, example of checked exceptions are class not found exception, IO exception, SQL exception, and so on. They occur usually interacting with outside resources or network resources, that is database problem or network connection error or missing file, etc. So these are all related to checked exceptions. Unchecked exceptions. Okay, so unchecked exceptions are not checked at compile time. So our syntactically our program, our code will be correct, but and it will be compiled correctly, but at the runtime we get some exceptions. Okay, so this is a runtime exception, but they are checked at runtime, so also called runtime exception. Example of unchecked exceptions are arithmetic exception, array index, array store exception. Okay, class cast exception, and so on. These are the some examples of unchecked exceptions. And error is different, as I said earlier. So error is irrecoverable. Okay, so we cannot recover errors. So some examples are out of memory errors, virtual machine error, and assertion error. So assertion we'll talk about while working with TestNG, uh, working with Selenium WebDriver testing. When we see the core of Selenium WebDriver, then we'll talk about assertion error while comparing with expected actual with expected. So we'll talk about error later on. So let's see some examples how exception occurs. Okay, so let me just create one project here. Here I'll create one package. And let me create some class. Let's see, demo exception one. So let's talk about first unchecked exceptions. Okay, which is coming at runtime. Okay, so let me write some int I is equal to 10, and let me divide this by 0. number is divided by 0. So let's see what will happen. So this gives an arithmetic exception, okay, by 0. So you can see at exception demo package, demo exception, and at eighth line, okay. So this line, it gives an error exception, okay. So let me just give an example. I mean, just print a statement at top and at last. So program starts, and let me just put it over here, and so if we run it again, so here we'll get the first statement is executed correctly, program starts, okay, and later this variable is initialized and we have written one statement, I by 0 means some number is divided by 0, so in that will give infinite results, okay. So integer cannot handle that infinite result, so it gives an arithmetic exception, okay. So let me just show you the hierarchy of this class. So if you see this arithmetic exception, so that comes under runtime exception, okay. So already we have seen that runtime exception, so runtime exception, so we got arithmetic exception, okay. So this hierarchy, so this arithmetic exception class is present under runtime exception class, okay. So this extends runtime exception, okay. So let me just come back. Yeah, and guys, one important point here is people might ask at the time of interview also. Let me just comment this, okay, and let me just give this as 12.0, okay. So what would be the result? Okay, now this is this value is decimal now, right? Or you can say double. So let me just run it. This will be treated as double, okay. So it will give infinity, okay. So this is the difference. So if you take it as integer, then it will throw an exception, and if we write double, okay, so this will execute perfectly, so it will give result infinity, okay. So this is different thing, just I wanted to talk about this one. So let me just uncomment this one and make it I. So this is an example of arithmetic exception, okay. So let me create another class to see another exception. So that is the runtime exception. So let me just create one more runtime exception. So let's have one array. So in this in type of array we have 5 elements, okay. So now let me just let's copy paste this starts and ends as well. And here let me just try to access uh, so index starts from 0, right? 0 1 2 3 4. Let me just access fifth element, so we'll see what it will print. So here we go, it gives array index out of bounds exception, okay. So if you can see in hierarchy, we got this index out of bounds exception, okay. because if you can see here, we have only 5 elements in our array. Okay, and we are trying to access fifth element, fifth index, right? So index is start from 0 0 1 2 3 4 and fifth which is not available in our array. Okay, so this is how we can get this I mean we'll get array index out of bound exception. Okay, so this is another example where we can get this kind of error, this kind of exception. Okay, let me just give another example. Let's have one string object. Okay, and let me just print this str dot length. So let me just run this first. So here we got length as 4, so we have 4 length of this string. Okay, now let me assign this string object to some null value. Okay, this string is referred to null value. Okay, so let me just run it. So here we go, we got a null pointer exception because now this string points to null value. Okay, null object. So whatever we will perform on this null object, it will give an error, null pointer exception, because this doesn't contain any value, so this will give null pointer exception. Okay, Java line number 11, so this is the 11 number. So these are different examples of unchecked exception. Okay, because syntactically all are looking good. Okay, syntax wise everything is fine, but at runtime while executing the program we got the exception. Okay, so these three examples are of unchecked exceptions. Okay, and let me just create for one more example for a checked exception. So let's have one object of file class. Okay, and here I'll give one path where we'll have one file. Let's say we have test.txt. This just I have given I mean this file is does not exist in the system, so I have just given this, and let me just import this file class from java.io, and we have another class file reader. And through this class I'm going to read this file. Okay, so I have to import this file reader from java.io, and in some cases even if you while using this class objects, okay, while working with file reader class objects, okay, so we get this kind of what you can say suggestions. Okay, so two quick fixes are available, so add throws declaration or surrounded with try catch. So let me just select this one, try catch. Anyways we are going to look into later on. So this is another keyword throws which will declare the exception. Okay, So that means this method may get an exception. Okay, later on we may get some exceptions in this what you can say in method. Okay, so that's why it declares an exception. Okay, like file not found exception while working with this class object. Okay, so uh, when we get this kind of suggestions, so at that time we can correct whether we have a file in our system or not. So that's why it throws an exception. Okay, so we have to declare like this, and see, now error is gone, so no error is there in this program. No what we can say, no error seen. So let me just run it. So here we go, we got this exception. Okay, file class not found, file not found exception. Okay, so this file does not exist in the system, so that's why we got this error. So that's how we get this, because this is compiler error, right? Program itself, it does not compile because this file does not exist in the system. So we are unable, I mean, this program does not able to read this file. So we got this file not found exception. So let me just see in the hierarchy. So this file not found exception comes under this class IO exception. So if you can see IO exception like this. So all these three types, like SQL exception, and IO exception, class not found, all these three belongs to checked exceptions, or you can say compile time exception. Okay, so these are different examples of exceptions. So in the next video, we'll talk about how to handle these exceptions. Okay, so just I have created all these programs, so we'll handle them in the next video. Okay, with try catch block. Okay, and we'll talk about some other keywords as well. So let me just go over. So we have a try catch block, okay, and we have finally keyword as well. So we'll talk about finally throws also. So thank you guys for watching. Have a nice day. We'll discuss exception handling part 2 in coming days. Okay, thank you. Bye bye.